So the next installment of the Whiteboard series is kind of a part 2 on the progressive loading, and this is in terms of rehab. So really rehab is just training in the presence of injury. But our variables that we're going to progressively load are going to be potentially different than what we are with normal training. So, so the main things or the first thing we really need to do is when we've been hurt or injured or anything like that, we need to figure out with our training what lifts are affected. Then we need to figure out what we need to modify with those lifts to accommodate the injury where we can train, and whatever we had to modify is the variable that we're going to progressively load. So it's not always just sets, reps, and weight like it is with the normal progressive, like normal training. Sometimes it might be like range of motion, that kind of thing. So the things that we might need to modify to accommodate the issue and to help train it and rehab it are the weight on the bar, it could be the sets and reps or function of the volume, the range of motion, or the positioning. So range of motion positioning is more just how you're executing the lift. So let's say like, bench press and you had a shoulder injury and you can't tolerate going down all the way. Well, we can modify and do maybe just the top end part of the range of motion that doesn't hurt. Maybe, having your elbows wider you can't tolerate that now, so you do more of a close grip or more of a narrower bench just to facilitate that. So those are variables you can adjust to where you can tolerate training, and then we can gradually progress back to our normal training over time. That's what we progressively load. So, and when you find what variables you need to modify, then you want to try to keep the others constant so you're not changing too much. Because let's say you just have to modify the weight. So let's say you're squatting 275 for 2 sets of 5, and you can't tolerate that weight, but you can tolerate the normal squat at like 225. So we go back to 225 for 2 sets of 5. Well, we're just going to try to stay at 2 sets of 5 and then progress at 225 to maybe 230 when we can, 235, and just increase that back gradually over time until we're at our normal working weights, rather than, okay, we did 225 for 2 sets of 5. Now the next time we're going to go 230 for like 2 sets of 8. So we've increased both weight and sets and reps in just one time, or from one session to the other. That can be a lot more of an increase than you realize. So you want to try to keep things that you don't have to modify constant and just progress the variable that you had to modify. Sometimes you might, if you step back way too far and you find out it was way too easy and didn't bother you at all, okay, that you can kind of make a little bit bigger of a jump. But if you're kind of on where you need to be with the appropriate stimulus, you don't want to make a lot of change. You want to make small increments, because things can get flared up pretty easy if you make too much of a big jump. And sometimes increasing a little weight and only adding a couple reps, sometimes that can be a lot more of the threshold for pain sometimes can be a lot lower than you think. And that can be a little more of a jump than you think. So it can tend to flare things up. So anyway, so find what variable you need to modify. That's what you progressively load. Try to keep the other things constant so you're not changing too much too fast. So the main guidelines you can use that will tell you and indicate that yes, this was an appropriate stimulus, whatever you did, and that yes, okay, next time I can increase, I can progressively load the next session. I'm ready. My injury has adapted to the point where it can handle the next increment of loading. So the first thing is, when you do the training session, the pain needs to be tolerable. So if you like pain scales like 0 to 10, I would say about 5 is a good cutoff. So it's kind of like moderate pain. So another way I like to really think about it is, as long as it's tolerable enough that it didn't make you want to stop, like, you're benching or you're squatting or whatever with you, and that's the affected thing, that pain's not bad enough that you're really sitting there like, I don't know if I want to do another rep kind of thing. If it's hurting that bad, that means you're not tolerating it. We need to back up a little more. So as long as pain's tolerable during, not above a 5 out of 10, I think we're good to go. We keep going. Then, so after the session, so the guidelines are going to tell you, okay, next session, the things that will indicate that it's time to progressively load to increase the next session are, so again, that it was tolerable during the session you just did, and then any pain that's after, sometimes things get kind of flared up or more sore, more crabby afterwards. That can be kind of normal, but that should settle down within about 24 hours. So about that same time the next day, if you're kind of back to where you were before you did that training session, then I think you're good. So that 24-hour window for things to flare up and then calm down, I think is okay. That should be something we can work with. It should get better over time. With that, a lot of times if it's more than 24 hours and it hangs with you longer, it's probably more of a function of the volume. The sets and reps probably need to be reduced a little bit. And then you repeat the session. That one's tricky because it's not going to tell you during the session so much. It's going to be more after. So then you have to kind of guess and make an adjustment for the next training session, wait till after that one to see if that was indicated. So that can get a little trickier, but pain's tricky anyways. It's very complex. See my first video on that in the Whiteboard series. So pain tolerable during the session. Anything that flares up afterwards settles down in about 24 hours. And then also another thing I like to think about is whatever training session that was, by the next time it's scheduled to do that same type of training session, you should feel ready to do so. So that's another thing that can indicate that, okay, you're tolerating this, it's appropriate for progression, that kind of thing. So now if pain is outside of that, so it's not tolerable during the session, or it was tolerable during, but it was flared up for like a day and a half or 2 days afterwards, or by the next time you were supposed to repeat that session, you had to modify it more, it was too crabby. So if that's happening, then you either want to stay where you're at and don't increase anything and stay with that until you're within those guidelines, then you progress, or you might even have to back up a little bit. So you maybe drop the weight a little more, or reduce the sets of reps a little bit, or maybe cut the range of motion back to what you had done previously, that kind of thing. So same idea as just normal training, except for we're not only just focused on sets and reps and weight. We might have to do some positioning, range of motion stuff for a progressive loading factor. And the weight that we progress may be very submaximal in terms of strength, but it may be right on the threshold of what the injury tolerates. We're trying to increase that threshold. So then you would basically do this and just gradually progress until you're back to normal training, and then you're back to normal training. Hey, look, rehab was just training. Yes, it was modified, but it was still training. And then, so that's why sometimes the delineation between rehab and training isn't necessarily a hard cut line. And then also, if you weren't training and you stopped, you did a bunch of old like traditional rehab stuff, and you went back to lifting, you're probably going to have to go through some form of this anyways, because you're going to be so untrained. That's why it's not only do I think this is superior for rehab, but also it's the same process. So you can just keep training, and you don't have to take this huge step back when you're ready to get back in training, because you're already training, you're already back there. So that could be a whole nother rant, but anyways. So progressive loading for rehab. Sounds kind of simple. Of course, it's never a very straightforward process, and every injury situation has its own very unique characteristics. There's a ton of factors and complexities that play into pain, but this can be a very good guideline, I think, for how to modify your training and how to get going. So if you need any help relating this and putting this into action with your own training and your own rehab, that's what I'm here for. So you can always send me an email, Caleb@Retrain Barbell, or you can direct message me on Instagram or Facebook, and then we can talk and get a plan going and get something figured out and get you progressively loading to get stronger, get bigger, rehab, any of the above.